Hello, and welcome to Bite-Sized Book Summaries. While I won't be doing a deep dive into the material today, I will be giving you spoilers and an honest review based solely on my professional opinion, as I do have a BS in BS. Let's get started. Trigger warning. The material discussed in this video is really messed up. Also, there's spoilers. Today I will be discussing Grady Hendrix's 2020 horror novel, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. Say that 10 times fast, which I did get from the library and in short will not be adding to my bookshelf at home. Let's talk about why. Keeping it short and sweet, whatever you expect, this book will not be that. The title and blurb fools a lot of people. Don't be the next victim. That's why I'm making this video, okay? I believe this is the main fault of the book, and it honestly might not have anything to do with Hendrix at all or his ability as a writer, but might be more on the publishing and marketing team that he had at the time. I don't seem alone in this analysis either, because whether they enjoyed the book or not, a lot of readers said the same thing as me in their reviews. And if you've already read and enjoyed How to Sell a Haunted House or The Final Girls Support Group like me, do not expect this book to be on the same level. Here's a quick summary. We follow Patricia. We start in the 1980s in Charleston, South Carolina, in a white, wealthy, close-knit, old-fashioned neighborhood. Patricia used to be a nurse, but then she married a doctor, had two bratty-ass kids, and moved to the burbs. That's where we're at. She's bored and lonely because her husband likes work more than he likes her, so she joins a book club which evolves into this random assortment of different flavored housewives along the way. One is fat and messy, one is northern and has no last name, one is so straight edge that she could cause serious injury, and one is super annoying and won't stop talking about Jesus Christ. They start reading trashy crime novels, some about real serial killers and some about fictitious murders. Then there's a time skip. Some years pass. Patricia gets attacked by a wacko neighbor, then that neighbor dies, Patricia feels bad for some reason, and then she ends up meeting that dead neighbor's nephew, who's new in town, named Jim Harris. Harris is a vampire. Obviously. We are told this on the inside of the front cover. So now we've got our vamp. Surely things will start to happen. They don't. Harris shows Patty a musty bag of $85,000 cash, and she has no questions about this. He also tells her that he has no form of government ID, so she needs to help him run errands and pay bills. And again, she does not question this. Then he says he has an autoimmune disorder because a wild dog bit him as a kid, so now a few UVs and his eyeballs are toast. Also, he gets sunburned almost immediately. And still, Patricia, who remember, used to be a nurse, says this is fine. This all adds up to me. Then an invasion of rats attack Patty's mother-in-law, killing her in their home. Don't worry, the dog lives. We know this must be due to Harris because he's a vampire. And because Patty's mother-in-law was the only person to recognize him for who and what he is. But then we just move on? So black kids are dying in 6 Mile, and none of the rich whiteys know or care about this except Patricia. She tries to investigate, but everybody tells her she's crazy. Even though she did see with her own 2 eyes James sucking on a little girl like she was a chili dog outside the Tasty Freeze. Then that girl kills herself, like all of his previous victims. And still Patty is the only one who thinks something is up with this dude, but she just doesn't know what. Mrs. Green, who used to be Patty's mother-in-law's carer, tries to get Patty to promise that she's gonna roll up like Batman and solve this mystery, stop these crimes, and then she will not stop reminding Patty for the rest of the book of how powerless and useless she is, even though she also admits that she knew that Patty was powerless and useless from the beginning. There are multiple time skips, and every time Patty has something, some scrap of evidence, every single person who is supposed to be her friend or ally turns on her because Jim Harris is rich. I'll save you roughly 200 pages of torture porn and leave it at that. Finally, after multiple years of Patty's husband manipulating and abusing her, of her Nazi kids, I wish that was an exaggeration, but it's not, hating her and verbally abusing her as well, and of her little girl gang book club who's supposed to be on her side, straight up not giving a shit about her or the Black community, Patty tries to kill herself. Okay, then there is another time skip. I honestly couldn't tell you how many there are in total. I couldn't, but this one jumps ahead 3 years. 3 years of this Harris character treating people like his personal juice boxes to suck dry and toss aside. Don't litter. That's bad. That's why he's the bad guy. And this whole time, no one is lifting a finger or a cross against him. Patty survives her attempt and becomes a brain-dead housewife to please her husband and keep her family together. But by now, the Black families have fled 6 Mile, so Mr. Jim Harris no longer has a food source that he can rely on and has to turn towards the rich white kids. Oh no, this might actually be a problem. Then the dead mother-in-law comes back as a ghost, and honestly, that was the creepiest part to me. Like, I almost got chills, even though, in a way, it was pretty heartwarming. She gives her old carer, Mrs. Green, the photograph that she was talking about before she was killed, which shows Jim Harris 60 years ago when the mother-in-law was a little girl, and he looks exactly the same. He hasn't aged. Oh my god, it's like he's a fucking vampire or something. This would have been a great reveal if you hadn't told us this right at the beginning, before the beginning, even. The only member of the book club who gives a shit about Patricia anymore is Slick, which makes us feel bad because for the rest of the book, she's been super annoying. So Patty gives her all the details, and Slick ends up getting attacked by Harris. Not in a fun, gory vampire way either. He R-words her. And while we aren't given all the details of the attack as it happens, we are given the visceral descriptions of the aftermath, which are horrific and gross. This book is never scary, really, but it is disgusting. Slick starts dying because of this, and with some scraps of evidence that have literally been there this entire time over multiple years, Patty and Mrs. Green are finally able to unite the members of the book club and get them motivated to do something through the magical powers of guilt and shame. Seriously, not a single one of these women puts the hoe in hero. This is not a girl power book. I cannot stress that enough to you right now. Their master plan involves them sacrificing Patty, which they're all totally okay with, then having the other women attack and dismember Harris, which they fuck up quite severely. There is literally no action in this book until very late in the final act, this fight scene, and that rat thing that happened all the way back in the beginning. And when I tell you, this final standoff was such a letdown. One of the women actually pisses her pants instead of helping. And the other one, Miss Big Girl, comes in swinging a baseball bat. Hooray! But then her internal monologue turns to how much she wishes there was someone there to just tell her what to do, and she reverts back to her useless housewife persona. So after a brutal physical act of battery, which really could have been done to anyone, not just a vampire. In fact, we don't see Mr. Man use any vampire powers for about the last 2/3 of the book. By the grace of God and Mrs. Green, they finally get him knocked down and chopped up. Patty is bleeding out on the bed or whatever. Once she's breathing, no one really cares anymore. Then the last girl gang member, Miss Straight Edge, shows up right at the end, after all the gory business is done, and reveals herself to be the true hero because she can clean good. Harris is taken care of. Slick dies. Patty divorces her husband, finally, and then her kids magically un-Nazi and un-brat themselves and decide they want to live with her. She gets one final visit from her dead mother-in-law, which could have been sweet, except it was literally just like a glimpse of her shoes. And then Patty reflects on how none of this would have been possible without all these rich white women who are good at vacuuming curtains and putting dinner on the table and knocking on doors at fortuitous times. Oh yeah, and Mrs. Green, who put together a binder of all the kids who had gone missing and killed themselves, dressed this man like a deer, and stayed after to help clean the crime scene for free. Because you just know the ladies in this book club are going to make the help work overtime. Look, a lot of people have already criticized this book, saying a lot of the same things I just did and more. But a lot of people really loved it too. Perhaps if you enjoy the kind of horror that is being stuck inside the mind of an isolated and perpetually helpless housewife who is surrounded by terrible, useless people and witnessing firsthand how every time she gets even a shred of hope or evidence, it's just slapped right out of her hand like candy from a toddler, she faces a lot of public embarrassment. Until the point where she actually attempts suicide. And maybe this book is for you, if that's what you're into. If you're more interested in a gross out factor than actual creepiness or terror, especially when it comes to just really visceral body horror, like all the details of rotting gunk coming out of someone's private parts and a roach crawling into someone's ear for no reason, because no, it wasn't one of the vampire's powers. I was really freaking hopeful that it might have been, because then that would have made this whole book cool and I would have been really interested in it, but they just build me up every single time and then slapped it out of my hands like candy from a toddler, remember? Then maybe this book is for you. But if you read and enjoyed the Final Girl support group like me, and you really loved not only the individual character development, but the development of the relationships, if you enjoyed the fast-moving plot full of action and twists, if you loved how darkly funny and absurd it was at times, and if you reveled in that triumphant ending, then the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires is probably not for you. There also needs to be a big fat trigger warning due to SA, child SA, suicide, domestic abuse. And while this story is supposed to take place across the 80s and 90s, I kept forgetting and thinking we were in the 50s and 60s until someone mentioned cheetah print or something. We spend more time on the horrors of everyday life in an unpleasant place full of unpleasant people who are very unhappy with their lives for one reason or another, but are just living for appearances at that point. But none of these characters fight against any of these systems at all. They just fight against one vampire across the whole book, and they barely do that even. Now, to be fair, the Final Girl support group and How to Sell a Haunted House have come out more recently than the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. And to me, this points to a trend of Hendrix just becoming a better novelist, or honestly, maybe just becoming more aligned with my personal tastes. This is really just for people who are on the fence about reading it and wanted to go in with maybe a little bit more preparation, and even for people who've already read it but are kind of on the fence with how they feel about it, or just don't feel like their opinion is valid. Because even at this point, although reviews are still pretty mixed, they are overall positive. I didn't DNF it, but that was really because of the sunk cost fallacy. I was hooked up to a plasma chair and had nothing else to read. I just had to power on. Again, the main issue for me was the disappointment with how this book is presented and what's actually inside. I felt lied to by the title, the cover, the marketing, the blurb, all of it. Maybe it would have been a decent read if I had known going in that it was a slow burn suburban horror about a isolated housewife who barely has any agency in her life and then doesn't get much by the end. But to be fair, I would have never read that book. And maybe it would have been better too if it wasn't given to us in the sleeve of the book that Harris was a vampire. Then we could have experienced the discovery along the way with the characters instead of getting super frustrated and feeling kind of cock-blocked for action as everybody inside took actual years of book time to catch up to that realization. Anyway, that's my bite-sized book summary for the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, which in my personal opinion, hold on, I wrote it down, should be called A Southern Housewife Has a Miserable Life, and oh, there's a vampire around too. But what do you think? let me know in the comments. And if you like this type of video, let me know. I will be making more of them. And if you don't like them, then go away, I guess. Bye.